So, chapter 2. The first thing I want to mention is the term ethnocentric. This is the outlook where we view history from the point of view of our own culture. And in this historical process, that is the point of view that we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of our own culture. So, Caribbean cultures. Early Caribbean culture would not have been recorded until the Europeans brought writings. However, through the archaeological evidence, we were able to reconstruct earlier cultures as far back as, if I'm not mistaken, 10,000 years before present, they said. So, I have a little timeline punched in here. So, migrations. Migrations is basically the movement of people, and it also means the movement of culture and society. Whenever people move, they move with their culture and what their previous society would have taught them and the values that they would hold all comes with them when they migrate. So the earliest Caribbean migrants, and again this is from archaeological evidence, would have been known to be in the Archaic Age, which was 10,000 years before present. So the Banwari remains found in Trinidad is dated back to about 7,000 years before present. Still in the Archaic Age, there's evidence of people all around the Greater and Lesser Antilles. So I assume they found remains of these indigenous people all along the Greater Antilles. Also in the Archaic period, I think the last set of people that were dated back with the archaeological evidence is Saladoid people. They moved from Venezuela into the Lesser Antilles. And today there's just going to be a lot of information thrown at you. I wouldn't say that all of it isn't necessary, but I would say that anything that sticks out at you that you think would be information that would be nice for, say, an essay in the future, if you've had a chance to look at some of the topics, or the kind of topics you get for the essay so far, then really pay attention to that information. Moving on still, but with the migration process. So we move from the Archaic Age now to the Ceramic Age. In the Ceramic Age, we have movements from the lower, I looked for the pronunciation just earlier, I think it is Orinoco. Well, the Orinoco people, and they were from Venezuela, and they moved into the Lesser Antilles, and they were referred to as the Barrancoid, and that was 2,200 years before present. So next we have the Ostinoid people, and they settled in the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas, and this is coming a little closer back to present, which is 1,400 years. So now getting into more what is the history that we're accustomed hearing when we think about Caribbean, and this is the development of the Tano society in the Greater Antilles. And then even further on we have the Caribs that moved to the Lesser Antilles, and this was around 1492, just before or around the same time that Columbus would have been said to arrive. I'm still continuing with migration. It's going to go on for a while. There's a lot to cover. So when the Europeans finally arrived, this is after 1492 of course, when they finally arrived, they labeled the people in the Greater Antilles as Arawaks. And even though they had the same language, or the language used was close to that of the Arawaks, these indigenous people did not regard themselves as Arawaks, however, and they referred to themselves as the Taínos. So, but even now, in present, when we're talking about history, we do tend to substitute the two names for each other, but it is important or imperative that you can differentiate between the Thanos history and the Arawak and Carib history. So we're going to the Caribs, I think, next, or a little later. A little later. Okay. So some of the earliest remains of Caribbean habitation are found in Trinidad and Cuba, and This has to do a lot with the migration we mentioned earlier, the 10,000 years before present. So if you look at a map, and I had in the maps and everything, and I have one map I think at the end of this one as well, but if you look at the maps, this would suggest that if you found these remains in Trinidad and Cuba, this would suggest that migrations into the Caribbean were not only from the north and the south, but also from Central America and Florida, which is contrary to popular belief. Scholars also believe that they came across the Bering Strait from Asia at the end of the last ice age. Now again, if you look at the map too, you will see that when that body of water was frozen, they were able to walk directly across. This is talked about very readily. They were able to walk directly across from Asia right into the Americas, across what we refer to as the Bering Strait. Next, also noteworthy is the different culture groups that were distinguished by their unique styles of pottery, ornamentation, and lifestyles. So this was in the early days, this was the way to differentiate between these indigenous people. They had different styles of, so for example, the Tano people and the Arawaks and maybe Caribs had different styles. And I was supposed to put in some images because I had found some, but I actually forgot. I did make the slides later when I post. So the pottery, the ornamentation, and the lifestyles were very different. And you'll get a little picture of the lifestyle when we see how the Spaniards refer to them, or refer to the difference in terms of the deposition of these people. So next we have an understated part of the historical process is the amount of contact and mobility that these people had. So a lot of times when we talk about this Caribbean history, we think of these people who were in a sense stagnant, who were just living here at the Caribbean and living like almost like in a Stone Age, very primitive, you know, they just feed off of the land, and they would go into the fields and plant or kill animals for food, and they would just basically live off, or what you would consider to be, can't remember the word right now, but I can't remember the word right now, but basically just live off the land, and there was no necessarily any surplus, or there wasn't bartering or any of those other things. But contrary to popular belief, there was, especially if you look at the Caribs. They use dugout canoes for trade with the inland dwellers, and would often backtrack for raw materials. So they would actually, because remember that the migratory process was literally, as it says, a process. So they were coming up throughout the lesser and / greater Antilles and stuff like that. But what they would do often is that they would actually trade with the people in the inland, and they would even go back down the line that they had migrated up to for raw materials and stuff like that. So they weren't necessarily living off of the land and being stagnant, and that's a very understated part of the historical process. When we think about it, we always think that they're just here and they weren't migrating or moving. So I move on now to a little more about the Tanos, and this is when I was speaking earlier towards when the Spaniards first met them and how they referred to them. So the Tanos evolved out of culture mixing and had a governing system. Again, we taught them to be very primitive, but they have a governing system where they had a chief of some sort, and he was almost like the leader, and they were actually a bit more organized than history usually tells us. They also had a stable economy. Like I said before, they would actually partake in trading with the inland people, and they did this at a surplus actually. So they had extra money and stuff like that. When the Spaniards came in and first met with them, they referred to the Tanos, I didn't put that in, but they referred to the Tanos as primitive and peace-loving. And the Caribs, on the other hand, were seen as very different than the Tanos. They were labeled with the Spaniards as warlike cannibals. And there are two reasons for this that we will get to in a second. And it's very interesting what the Spaniards do. and there's a little toss-up between, actually I think it's on the next slide, right. The Tanos, however, were labeled as primitive and peaceful, but they actually had to ally with the Caribs, and they staged an uprising against the Spanish rule, because the Spanish were actually enslaving the Tanos, again because of their peaceful nature, and using them for, you know, slave work and stuff like that. But I guess at one point it became too much, and they actually allied with the Caribs and held this uprising against the Spanish rule. So here are the two theories that came out of this. It is possible that the Spaniards mistook and distorted the religious practices of the Caribs and used that as an excuse that they were like beasts to get rid of them. However, that was not necessarily the case, because again, a lot of the practices that they had were not necessarily beast-like, but it was religious practices, and if they had paid careful attention, or more careful attention to these people, they will realize that that was not the case. And obviously there was a language barrier and stuff like that, so it was just very subjective and very much about what you saw and how you interpreted it. So a counterpoint to this, though, is that the Spaniards weren't foolish, and that is that they were running out of Tano laborers, and they used this excuse, saying that the people were primitive and beast-like and cannibals and stuff like that, as an excuse to subjugate the Caribs because they wanted more slaves. And I won't go as far to say which one I think it is, but I mean, you can do some more reading on it, or you can have your own say. But it is presumptuous for us to believe that the Spaniards really mistook these religious practices for being Tanos being beast-like people, especially after they called them, the Caribs being beast-like people, especially after they mistook the Tanos for the Caribs. It's funny now to come back and see that they had such a disparity between the two people. Anywho, even though the Tano people were thought to be wiped out, though, there was a lot of DNA, and obviously, you know, everybody trying to find out where they came from and stuff like that. So a lot of DNA in the recent times DNA testing in the recent times have happened, and there's evidence is actually telling a different tale, meaning that it seems as though all Tanos weren't wiped out, and that the bloodline still goes on to today in some parts of the Lesser and Greater Antilles. Moving on. So I move on now to European migration. So first of all, Columbus was more than likely not the first European to visit the Americas. It is likely that other Europeans did visit the Americas first, but it was under the circumstances which Columbus came to, I guess you could say, the Americas or the Caribbean, that it became such a big thing. So the only reason the discovery of the Caribbean caused such a stir was because they found gold and precious stones. Now, later on, you realize that there was I'll cover it later, but I just want to speak on it now. You realize that there was a rivalry between the Portuguese and, I think, Spain. And I think that Columbus was actually originally from Portugal, but Portugal had a very strict migratory process, or because they were basically going around and basically claiming lands and stuff like that. I can't remember the word for all of that right now, but they were doing that, they were engaging in that. But Columbus had this dream, this elusive dream about, you know, go westward over the Atlantic Ocean and you can basically be doing a full circle. And he had the idea, they're correct, that you would meet lands over there. And it's more than likely that other Europeans did it before him. But because he left from Portugal and decided to, and got the funding from Spain, the King and Queen of Spain, to go and find these lands and see what he could find. Because of that, then, he did discover the gold and precious stones, and it obviously piqued the interest there and then of the King and the Queen, and that is why the Caribbean became such a big thing. And the second factor, and this factor is more towards why the Spanish settled in the Caribbean, was that there was a large residence of, again, the Tanos, and that could be easily used as slave labor. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on this slide. So here's what I was talking about, and this is the Iberian Rivalry. Spain and Portugal were nations of the Iberian Peninsula, and these two nations were, like I said before, this was the word exploratory or explorate. And sorry, these two nations were both in exploration, and Portugal was far more concerned with Africa and the Indian Ocean. So they were heading up the west coast, I think it was. Yeah, they were heading up the west coast of Africa and going along the Indian Ocean and going up that way. But Columbus was far more interested in that elusive land, or that illusionary land, that we refer to now as the Americas or the Caribbean. So like I said, he got the funding from Spain and went across and do it. But now that this gold started to come back from the Americas, and Spain was basically making all the profit and stuff like that, Portugal wanted in. And this, of course, would have caused an all-out war, because it was, they found gold, So it was a very big thing, and there was a lot of tension around there, because, of course, as soon as Portugal realized that this is what was happening, they started to also invade and try to get a slice of the pie as well. So the Pope at this time, I think it was Alexander the Fourth, he, fearing about this all-out war, not really necessarily wanting it to happen, he thought up of what is known now as the Treaty of Tordesillas. And this treaty basically set in motion would basically proportion, or would basically segment in a way control over the world outside Europe, and so that they wouldn't have to fight over it. It was set up so that they would not cross boundaries, and this part was for Portugal and this part was for Spain or what have you. But of course, this did not necessarily include France and the Roman authority. He had no authority over them. So they would do raids, and so it was fair game for them. They would do raids and piracy, smuggling, and also do illegal trading and stuff like that. And those other nations would come in and still reap a lot of the benefit as a result of this treaty. Yeah, that's basically what I say. So moving on now, I want to move on to the slave trade. So, yeah, I want to go on to slave trade. So, actually, before I do that, let me talk quickly about the Spanish stranglehold. For about 100 years, or well, over 100 years, after Columbus claimed the Americas for Spain, because obviously he was the first, or the so-called first to do it, and for over 100 years it was just his or whatever, but then British and France, again, this was as a result of the Treaty of Tordesillas. British and France, as I said before, they came in, but it was so, the raids and the piracy that I mentioned before, and the smuggling was so much that it actually laid siege and destroyed the Spanish settlements that were already there, and they would steal the treasures, and they actually had names. They were the buccaneers, the privateers, and I think just pirates. And they came in and ended it all for Spain in a sense. So it no longer belonged to Spain. Spain would no longer send any more manpower over there, because they would just be raided and smuggled from it and stuff like that. So, like I said, now I want to continue on with the slave trade. So the start of the slave trade was solely by the Portuguese. Solely by the Portuguese at first. And this was because the Spanish was not permitted to trade in Africa. But eventually the Dutch, the French, and the British, and again, this is why we have the Dutch Antilles, and why some parts of the Caribbean speak French and all this. I would have talked about all this in the first lecture when I was talking, or the first chapter when I was talking about, the culture's impact on the Caribbean, and how the French speaking and the Spanish speaking and all of that end up being here. And this is how right here. So as I said, Spain was not permitted to trade in Africa, but the Dutch and the French and the British began to also participate in this slave trade that was started by the Portuguese. So gradually they actually almost took over, and eventually took over, and they dominated the Atlantic slave trade from the 16th right through to the 19th century, when it was finally abolished. But of course, before it abolished, a lot of stuff happened, and I won't cover some of that now. So forced migrations of the Africans was one of the things that happened. First of all, I'd like to ask the question, did Africans come to the Americas before Columbus? Now, some scholars do believe that, even though, before like the 16th to the 19th century, that slavery, or more 17th to 19th, slavery was going on in Spain for years, even before this Atlantic slave trade. This is just one of the biggest slave trades, and I will get into why it was so central later. So while slavery was going on in Spain for years, slaves were of different ethnicities, and as you see, the ethnicities I have here, none of them were African. They were Jews, the Moors, and the Canaries people, Canary Islanders, rather than Africans. This makes it possible, or it's possible to believe then, because of this, that when we had the first expedition of the Spanish into the Americas, that it's possible free African people was on that expedition as well, obviously to work as hands on the ship and stuff like that. And it's also plausible that they stayed, because it was a sustainable environment, and they were doing back and forth trading, so there were always ships going and coming. It's possible somebody say, oh, we could start a family here, and then family come over the next ship, what have you. So it's very possible that Africans were here and free before the Atlantic slave trade. Anywho, like I said, the focal point though, because remember, slavery was going on long before this 17th to 19th century. The focal point of the Atlantic slave trade, it wasn't that it was forced migration of millions of people over time, or millions of Africans, to basically serve in captivity. It wasn't because it continued for centuries, literally hundreds of years. It wasn't because it supported an economy, or that they needed the slave trade as a means of money to keep the countries afloat. That was not the case. But the foundation of this slave trade was solely based on race. Solely based on race. So over time, the perceptions of Africans, or during this period I keep mentioning, over time this perception of Africans just became full-blown racism. We don't learn in Caribbean studies exactly what is the reason for it, because as I say, slaves originally were not African people. But over time, it became full-blown racism, and it was particularly in the 18th and 19th century, before it was abolished sometime in the 19th century. So that's very, very interesting to know. And lastly, I want to talk on this. This is the last thing I covered today, because if I go on from here, I have to go on to, well, actually, this kind of goes on for a while. It has different parts, but I don't want to get into them yet. I just want to cover this part, because then it's going to go on to like a whole new topic that I don't want to stop halfway. But this this picture here, I had stress finding this, but this picture here shows the Atlantic slave trade, and it gives an approximation of the numbers of slaves that were traded or migrated, forced migration really, over those centuries. And it is interesting to note as well that this is a very conservative estimate, but as you can see, from British North America and United States, we have 500,000 slaves, and then the biggest of all really was the Atlantic slave trade, which was West Indies, Africa to West Indies, and that was 4,128,000. Then we see Brazil with another whopping 4 million, from Africa down to South Africa. Those people, of course, moved up. I don't know if you've seen them most, but those people, of course, moved up into the Lesser Antilles. and then the Spanish Empire was another 2 million some, and those moved deeper down into South America. Another thing I wanted to note here before I close is that I want to give you a timeline. It was between, I think it started in around 1503, so actually even a lot back, but of course it didn't catch fire until later, but around 1503 was the date that they have for when they started, and they say by 1520 the Spanish Crown had permission now, because remember at first they told that the Spanish were not permitted to be part of this African slave trade, but by 1520 they had permission to import Africans as slaves to supplement the Tanos that they had enslaved that were dying out. I think one more thing. So it was basically from 1503 right into the 19th century, which is 19 something, that this was happening. Anyway, this is where I'll close for now. Like I said, I don't want to go into the next part of it because I'm going to have to end somewhere in the middle. So I prefer to end right here because this is the start of a new part. Next week I'm going to still sticking with this, still sticking with the historical process. I think if I get some good time to prepare some more comprehensive slides that are a little more summarized, then I should be able to finish the rest of this chapter next week. Actually, no, I'm looking at it and I may have to split it up into 2 more pieces. Well, it is what it is. It is a very, 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 very lot in terms of this historical process. There's a lot to cover. I haven't covered any of the economic parts of it, government, none of that hasn't come into play yet. It was just really about the enslaved people, Spanish, the British, the French, and the Dutch.